There are moments in history when the veil of our reality seems to tear a little.
There are objects in the skies that we don't know exactly what they are.
When war looms, when the atom is split, when institutions lose their authority, and when people no longer trust the ground beneath their feet. Across our timeline in those psychologically challenging moments, strange things tend to appear in the sky. A spinning sun over Fatima, burning spheres above Renaissance cities, silent objects near nuclear reactors. For centuries, we've treated these things as different categories: miracle, omen, weapon, spacecraft, and maybe the strangest part is that they seem to appear exactly when humanity is most desperate for meaning or most afraid of its own power. If you're anything like me, you'll have questions, and maybe the Overton window has shifted just enough for us to finally ask, what are UFOs? Are they interdimensional or extraterrestrial visitors, secret military technology, or a psyop designed as a distraction? Maybe a psychological projection, some sort of shared hallucination based on a modern myth? Or maybe a crack in the simulation with the admins checking in? There are others who would suggest that it's harder to define, a phenomenon that lives somewhere between the physical world and the human soul. Are you interested in finding out? UFOs, UAPs, I wouldn't blame you at all for thinking this was a modern phenomenon. But before radar, stealth planes, and even the fairly new language of nuts and bolts encounters, human beings were already looking upward and seeing something that they couldn't comprehend. Not just stars or storms, but signs. Things that seemed to break the ordinary order of the sky. Lights, shapes, wheels, and burning forms. Objects that moved strangely. Colors that shouldn't be there. Displays that felt less like weather and more like a message. And maybe that's where this story begins, not with aliens or agendered government agents, but with a much older human instinct. That when something impossible appears above us, it presents meaning. Let's travel back in time to 1917, to Fatima, Portugal, with tens of thousands of people gathered in a field under heavy rain. They had chosen to gather because earlier, 3 shepherd children had claimed that the Virgin Mary had appeared to them and promised that on this specific day, a sign would be given. October 13th arrived and the crowd swelled. Believers, skeptics, journalists, both the cynical and the curious. Some had come to pray, while others had arrived to watch the prophecy fail. And then, according to many of those witnesses, something happened. The clouds broke. The sun appeared, but not as an unbearable blaze, but as a strange spinning disc that could be looked at directly. Witnesses said that it changed colours, that it cast bands of blue, red and violet across the crowd and the landscape, that it seemed to tremble, then lurch, then plunge towards the earth in a zigzagging motion, as if the sky itself had come loose. Some people screamed, others dropped to their knees, and many thought they were watching the end of the world. Accounts vary, but this event did happen. Skeptics have struggled to offer a solution, claiming it was either a meteor shower, a joint hallucination, or eye floaters from staring at the sun for too long. But when the encounter was over, another detail lingered like a challenge to common sense. The ground soaked from the storm, and the clothes of the many who'd been standing in the mud and rain were said to suddenly be dry. Whatever happened at Fatima, it did not arrive as a neutral event. It arrived inside a world of prayer, prophecy, fear, longing, and expectation. The scene that humanity had set itself that day was emotionally charged, and it's almost as if the psychological consensus of the many, for a brief moment, shifted the nature of reality. Whether it's a miracle or a mass psychological event, one thing is certain: it's not the only time that something like this has happened. If we travel even further back in time, long before the 20th century gave us flying saucers and military footage, we find evidence that the sky was already crowded with impossible things. In 1561 in Nuremberg, Germany, a broadsheet described a terrifying spectacle seen at dawn. Witnesses reported the sun surrounded by strange forms, spheres, crosses, tubes and cylinders, dark and blood-red objects moving back and forth as if in conflict. It was described as a battle, with the losers falling from the sky and dissolving into smoke beyond the city. The scene was chaotic, almost warlike. To a modern eye, it reads uncannily like the language of a UFO encounter. An aerial battle, multiple objects, intelligent movement, a sky full of things that don't behave the way ordinary things should. But that is not how people in 1561 understood it. To them, it wasn't an extraterrestrial craft with visitors from another star system or a fancy AI-driven system in flight. No, it was a warning, a sign from God, a message about judgment, and a demand for repentance in a world already saturated with religious meaning. Just a few years later, in 1566, another strange outbreak erupted over Basel, Switzerland. Again, the reports describe dark and fiery shapes in the sky, black spheres, red forms, fast-moving objects seeming to collide, chase, and struggle in the air. The sun itself was described as losing its radiance, turning bloody, almost wounded. Today, some people look at these accounts and try to retrofit them into the modern UFO canon. The first alien battle, ancient aerial warfare, evidence that the phenomenon has always been here. Maybe, but my takeaway is not simply that people saw strange things in the sky, it's that they interpreted those anomalies through the symbolic vocabulary available to them at the time. In the 16th century, the heavens were not an empty backdrop. Culturally, they were alive with divine significance. So when something broke the normal order of the sky, it wasn't filed under aerospace mystery, it didn't go to arrow. Instead, it was absorbed into myth. If you think about how we actually experience reality, is through a shared story, filled with symbols, expectations, fears, and desires. We're not just observing, we're interpreting each moment. And 500 years ago, a burning object over a medieval city becomes an omen. A radiant figure becomes an angel. A spinning sun becomes a miracle. And in the modern world, where religion has weakened, institutions have fractured, and technology has colonized the imagination, the unknown arrives wearing metal. Now it becomes a craft, a disc, a vehicle, an intelligence from elsewhere. Perhaps the deeper pattern hasn't changed nearly as much as we think it has, because across centuries, the sky has remained the perfect screen for whatever a culture fears, hopes for, or cannot yet explain. A place where apocalypse, salvation, judgment, invasion, transcendence, and mystery can all be projected all at once. Could it be possible that the modern UFO is not a new phenomenon, but instead a new mask? If the modern UFO is a new mask, then it emerges at a very specific moment in history. In today's world, we pride ourselves on being a secular society, where older religious frameworks and institutions have begun to weaken. Largely, this has been seen as a good thing, because if you look at the history of evil caused by these institutions, it makes sense that a more empathic and progressive civilization would be keen to distance itself from that evil. But in doing so, we've also pushed the heavens away. We've redrawn the universe with science, but have fundamentally fallen short on the question of meaning. Our lean and logical society has led us to become more rational, more technological, but more bureaucratic, and somehow more haunted. Because although the 20th century gave us new machines, it also gave us new anxieties. World wars, mass propaganda, nuclear weapons. Those angels in the sky have been replaced with missiles raining down a sort of literal hell on those below. This is a future shaped by radar, surveillance, and the terrifying possibility that humanity now possesses the power to erase itself. And in the middle of all that, the old signs and symbols return, only now they carry a different aesthetic. They're no longer wheels of fire, seraphim, or bloody omens over cathedral towns. Now they arrive as discs, metallic objects, mechanisms that defy the laws of physics. We now frame them as technology, but with an edge of impossibility still attached. In other words, the phenomenon modernized. And few people understand the deeper implications of that better than Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. He wrote about UFOs in the 1950s during the height of the Cold War, when sightings were spreading through public consciousness and the world was living under the shadow of atomic annihilation. He approached the subject carefully as a skeptic, but fascinated by the psychological implications on the wider human culture. For Jung, the question wasn't just about the nuts and bolts framing that has permeated in UFO communities over the last couple of centuries, whether these things are physically real. It was also, why now? Why this image? Why does the psyche suddenly begin populating the heavens with circular, luminous, otherworldly forms at the exact moment humanity becomes globally anxious, spiritually fractured, and technologically unstable? And his answer was unsettling. Jung suggested that UFOs might function like modern myths, not necessarily falsehoods, but symbolic forms through which a culture expresses something it cannot otherwise contain. A hope, a fear, a warning, a longing for intervention from beyond the human world. He noticed that in periods of profound instability, people tend to generate symbols of order. And what is a luminous disk in the sky if not a kind of perfect form? A circle, a mandala, a symbol of wholeness breaking into a fractured age. But that was only one side of the coin, because while on one side there's salvation, on the flip side there's dread. He once said that these aerial forms could carry the expectation of a saviour, but also something much older and darker, a ship of death, not a divine rescue, but a vessel arriving to collect souls. A sign not that humanity would be redeemed, but that it was approaching catastrophe. Jung was a man obsessed with opposites and extremes, and in the case of UFOs, he likely saw duality in hope and terror, deliverance and judgment, contact and extinction, the dream that something higher is watching us, and the fear that it may be arriving because something has gone terribly wrong. We do not meet the unknown empty-handed. We meet it carrying myth. That idea becomes even more interesting when you look at how people actually describe anomalous experiences. Religious scholar Diana Pasulka has pointed out that when people encounter something they can't explain, they often do not immediately frame it as mystical or transcendent. In fact, they usually do the opposite. They reach for the least embarrassing explanation available. And that instinct makes sense. No one wants to be the person who says they saw a miracle, or an angel, or a UFO. If you've had synchronicities in your life, moments of meaning that defy logic, you'll understand that when you try and share them, it'll freak people out. You could even be ostracized or called crazy. So often people downplay these experiences. They translate these moments into something dull, force it into familiar categories, even when it doesn't quite fit. And that reveals something quite interesting. The line between a religious encounter and a UFO encounter may not be as solid as we like to imagine, because the raw experience comes first. The interpretation comes after. One age calls it a sign from God, another calls it a craft, another calls it a psychological event, but beneath those labels is the same human problem. Something appeared, something was seen. And the witness had to make it intelligible using the language their culture gave them. And that might be why the imagery changes with history. As religion fades, technology steps in to inherit the symbolic weight. Tradition leaps forward towards technology. And then the heavens are no longer imagined as populated by angels and saints. Instead, it's dominated by military power, foreign adversaries, secret programs, and things that may or may not belong here. When the impossible returns, it no longer arrives in robes and wings. It presents itself in symbolism which we can universally understand as hardware. This is the world of the nuts and bolts UFO, the metallic object, the impossible maneuver, the craft with no visible propulsion, the machine that doesn't behave like a machine should. And there is one thread in particular that makes this modern version of the phenomenon feel uniquely disturbing, because again and again these objects seem drawn to places where humanity stores its greatest power and its greatest potential for self-destruction. The moment humanity learned how to split the atom, the sky seemed to start looking back. Since the 1940s, reports of strange aerial phenomena have clustered around nuclear sites, weapon facilities, and reactors. At Los Alamos, Hanford, across Cold War missile fields, near bases that house nuclear weapons. At moments, the species had crossed some sort of threshold that it could no longer uncross. In the American West, mysterious green fireballs were reported near atomic research sites in the late 1940s. At Malmstrom Air Force Base in 1967, military witnesses described sightings over missile silos alongside unexplained malfunctions in nuclear systems. At Rendlesham Forest in 1980, strange lights appeared near a base associated with the storage of nuclear weapons. Decades later, reports and rumours would continue to accumulate around places like Chernobyl and Fukushima. Glowing objects over reactors, slow-moving lights in irradiated air. Stories that emerge in the aftermath of catastrophe, as if the phenomenon had some eerie instinct for appearing whenever humanity had disturbed the foundations of its own world. Now, to be careful here, this doesn't prove alien intervention, benevolent monitoring, or anything else clean and final. Some of these stories might be distorted in their retelling, misidentifications, or even ordinary lights half seen through trauma, secrecy, and fear. But the pattern is still hard to ignore. Why do these stories so often gather around nuclear fire? Why does the phenomenon seem magnetized to the very places where humanity flirts with apocalypse? One possibility seems translucent. If there is an external intelligence behind some of these events, then our nuclear capacity might be the one thing about us that's impossible to ignore. Maybe it's one of the clearest signs that a young species has become technologically dangerous before it has become psychologically wise. That's one reading. But there is another. Maybe the nuclear connection matters because the bomb changed the human psyche forever. Before the atom, the apocalypse belonged mostly to religion, prophecy, and myth. After the atom, it became engineering. For the first time, humanity could imagine the literal end of the world not as divine judgments, but as a button, a code, a launch sequence. And once that possibility entered history, the sky itself became charged with a new kind of attention. Not just fear of invasion, but fear of ourselves. It could be why modern UFOs carry such a strange emotional atmosphere. There are theories that the Greys are future humans who've adapted to living in a post-nuclear world in caves underground. That's a particularly creepy one that I don't enjoy giving much thought to. That said, UFOs are an odd phenomenon that feel half physical and half symbolic, half hardware and half dream. It's known that a lot of abduction stories share similarities to sleep paralysis encounters. And it all makes the modern UFO narratives difficult to pin down because it behaves like a material object that exists in the physical world, but also like a projection of a wider cultural idea. A pressure point where the outer world and the inner world seem to touch. And maybe that's why this subject never quite settles, because every attempt to reduce it leaves something behind. Call it extraterrestrial and you still have to explain the religious and psychological charge. Call it projection and you still have to explain the persistent reports of structured objects, radar returns, military encounters, and recurring physical patterns. If it is secret technology, you still have to explain why it easily absorbs myth. Maybe they really are visitors keeping their little human zoo in check. Or it's possible that it's surveillance platforms, black projects, or adversarial probes, secrets and advanced technology built by the powers that be to maintain a sense of control. Or maybe they are projections wrapped around real events, mass hallucinations that we experience in moments of a meaning crisis. But whatever they are, they seem to gather at our thresholds. War, revelation, annihilation, and transformation. And it has me wondering what kind of an age has made us ready to see it this way. At this point, the obvious temptation is to choose a side, to force the phenomenon into a single explanation, whether that's aliens, secret weapons, mass delusion, or government lies, or even a glitch in reality itself. But the longer you stay with this subject, the more it resists that kind of closure. And you may have noticed an uptick in films and media around disclosure, yet it always feels like it's an inch away from our grasp. One of the most grounded explanations is also one of the most unsettling. The phenomenon has sometimes been useful, not necessarily as proof of extraterrestrials, but as cover, as camouflage for military secrecy, a convenient fog around technologies too advanced, too classified, or too strategically sensitive to name openly. Dozens of scientists go missing or are found dead when they're close to breakthroughs which could reduce our oil dependency. And for decades, more common rumors around places like Area 51 helped create an atmosphere in which the truly real could hide in the absurd. If people saw something impossible in the desert, something angular, silent, and unnatural, well, better that they whisper about alien craft than get too close to the truth of what their own government might actually be testing. And according to later reporting, that wasn't always accidental. There have been admissions that UFO folklore was at times allowed to flourish, even nudged along, because it served a purpose, confuse the public, mislead foreign adversaries, protect black projects by wrapping them in ridicule. In that sense, the UFO story becomes a kind of state-sponsored myth, a place where profiteering, crime, and corruption can fester in the dark, a useful distortion, a hall of mirrors where truth, rumor, secrecy, and spectacle blur together until no one can tell what belongs to which category anymore. Our nihilistic logical tendencies, including our debunking, can become part of that machinery, because control does not only come from making people believe in strange things, it can also come from teaching them to dismiss too quickly, to ridicule witnesses on reflex, to file away anything anomalous as either fantasy or error before the deeper questions have had time to form. That's what makes the Psyop possibility so powerful. It doesn't require that every sighting be fake, only that ambiguity itself has value. And the state, like any institution built around power, often benefits when people cannot clearly distinguish between what is absurd and what is classified. It reminds us that not every mystery is metaphysical, and that some mysteries are manufactured, strategic, and bureaucratic. Some wear the face of the unbelievable because the unbelievable is easier to hide behind. And yet, pure reduction never quite solves it, because once you account for the hoaxes, misidentifications, exaggerations, folklore, disinformation, attention-seeking black projects, drones, balloons, and all of the rubbish that human beings are perfectly capable of mistaking for revelation, there is still something left over. Cases that remain stubborn, witnesses who do not fit the stereotype, and descriptions that persist across decades. The strange fact that even when the phenomenon is explained away in one register, it often survives in another. What if the phenomenon is difficult to solve because it does not entirely belong to the material world? Not visitors from another planet in the old science fiction sense, but intelligences, operations, or appearances emerging from hidden layers of reality that overlap our own. Forget about the little green pilot crossing interstellar space in a metal ship. The reality of it could be far stranger. The ultra-terrestrial idea, the interdimensional idea, the notion that what people call UFOs may not be arriving from far away, but from just outside the frame. Not across space, but across levels. That might sound like a modern speculation, or an idea lifted from Stranger Things, but in another sense it isn't modern at all, because history is full of accounts of beings and apparitions that seem to behave in similarly elusive ways. There are fairies, angels, demons, spirits, presences that interrupt ordinary reality, obey strange laws, provoke awe and disorientation, and then vanish again before they can be comfortably contained. What changes across time may not be the phenomenon itself, but the costume. One age sees a heavenly host, another sees a silver disc, another sees a machine shaped by impossible geometry. And perhaps that is because the unknown presents itself through forms that age can metabolize, or forms that disturb it most effectively. That possibility becomes even more provocative when you look at the modern cases that seem to break the normal rules. Objects accelerating without visible propulsion, instant directional changes, no clear wings, no ordinary heat signature, no obvious concern for the laws of inertia that govern everything else we call a machine. The famous Tic Tac accounts live here. I've heard its movements described like a mouse cursor navigating a video game world. And whatever interpretation you land on, those reports create a very modern kind of metaphysical pressure, because if the descriptions are even partially accurate, then what we're talking about is not just advanced engineering. It is behavior that appears to step outside the physical script. And the moment something appears to violate the expected rules of the world, another possibility enters the room. That reality itself may not be as fixed, solid, or closed as we assume. This is where simulation theory enters the story. The idea that our reality may not be the ultimate reality, but instead a derivative world, a governed system, a set of constraints imposed from somewhere deeper. In that framework, UFOs are no longer just craft. They could be intrusions, admin tools, diagnostics, render errors, interventions from outside the visible map. Not alien visitors crossing the galaxy, but operators touching the simulation. Now, in an AI-driven future, is that concept really so difficult to consider? Because beneath it lies a very old intuition that reality may be layered, that the visible world may not be the deepest one, and behind appearances there could be a hidden architecture, and that occasionally something slips through from the level above. Whether you call that Maya, spirit, the collective unconscious, base reality, the divine pleroma, or even the simulation, the structure of the idea remains hauntingly similar, and suddenly the old categories begin to blur. A miracle, a vision, a craft. a projection, a psychological event, a surveillance platform, a symbolic eruption. These may not be mutually exclusive descriptions. They might be different attempts to describe contact with something that sits right at the boundary of matter and meaning. And maybe that's why the phenomenon has survived every attempt to kill it, because it's not just one thing. Some cases might be prosaic, misidentified aircraft, drones, balloons, planets, atmospheric events in the sky. Some might be secret military technology hidden in plain sight behind decades of cultivated absurdity. Some might be mistakes made under stress by frightened, fallible human beings trying to tell the truth about an experience they do not fully understand. Some may be projections in the Jungian sense, where the psyche clothes the unknown in forms charged with collective fear and longing. And still, they may be a reminder of something genuinely anomalous, not necessarily little spacemen in a vehicle. Maybe that image is far too small for the problem, but instead an intelligence, force, or intrusion that doesn't fit neatly inside our existing map of reality. A UFO is what happens when old religious frameworks begin to collapse, but the hunger for transcendence remains. When the heavens no longer feel inhabited by God, but we still can't shake the intuition that something is watching, waiting, or trying to get through to us. Maybe that's why the phenomenon returns and persists, not because humanity's solved it, but because we keep recreating the conditions that make it feel necessary. When you look out at the world today, is it a surprise when ordinary people wish for change? When those at the top of society are leading us into pointless wars, towards an energy crisis and potential famine? When young soldiers encounter death at the hands of their brothers, can you blame them for looking for meaning from the heavens above? Sometimes the world we exist within is harder to believe in than science fiction and fantasy. And deep down, I think we all understand that it doesn't need to be like this. And what if, in those moments, something appears in the sky? Not always the same thing, not always for the same reason, and not always with the same explanation, but always with the same effect, interrupting the story we were telling ourselves about reality. Debunk one case, another appears. Reduce it to folklore, and it re-emerges in military footage. Frame it as secret technology, and the mythological charge still clings to it. Call it projection, and the witness still points upward. Call it hardware, and the symbolism keeps bleeding through metal. It refuses to remain as one thing, and maybe that's the point. Maybe the topic requires a more balanced viewpoint. Too skeptical and you'll miss the magic, but too spiritually hungry and you'll miss the point. Both sides protect us from having to sit with an even harder possibility. That reality may be stranger than our institutions admit, and stranger than our fantasies can comfortably contain. I think that's why UFOs continue to fascinate people who otherwise disagree about almost everything. Because beneath the arguments about aliens, psyops, drones, radar signatures, and classified programs, there is a more intimate question unfolding. What does it mean that human beings keep encountering something that seems to stand right at the edge of explanation? Something that shifts with the culture, that absorbs myth, that appears during a crisis, and that mirrors fear and hope at the same time. Could it be that the phenomenon doesn't only challenge our model of the universe, but also challenges our own model of ourselves? Because for all of our technology, all of our surveillance, and all of our systems of measurement and control, we're still the same species that once looked into the heavens for signs, still frightened, still longing, still trying to work out whether the silence above us is empty or inhabited. And if the modern world has done anything, it has only amplified that tension. We have more information than ever, more images, footage and witness testimonies, and somehow perhaps less wisdom. We know how to build machines powerful enough to end civilization, and how to saturate ourselves with so much noise that it no longer matters. When the atom was split, the heavens didn't exactly open, but perhaps they began speaking again in a new language, not through prophets, scripture or burning chariots, but through ambiguity, through rumors, visions, data, silence, fear, fascination, and things that seem to hover just beyond the edge of consensus reality. Is it possible that the phenomenon is not here to give us answers, but instead to expose the questions we have been avoiding? Questions about consciousness, power, meaning, about whether reality is as closed as we pretend it is, whether our technology has outrun our wisdom, and whether we're alone. And if we're not, who do we need to become to avoid collapsing into worship, hysteria, and denial? Reality is getting stranger by the minute, and our understanding of what's possible is opening up with that too. And in that complexity, there's also confusion, more questions than answers. And the one that I'm left with at the end of all of this is, why does something always seem to appear when we're most at risk of losing our minds, our meaning, or our soul?